Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the trip here. No pun intended there. So, I'm Sumant Kulkarni, and I cover neuro-focused stocks for Canaccord Genuity.
The audio is off.
Oh, okay. I'm going to repeat that. Other than the joke, I'm going to repeat everything else. Thank you to everyone for coming. I'm Sumant Kulkarni, and I cover neuro-focused stocks for Canaccord Genuity, which is an investment bank. As I mentioned earlier in the day, at the Alzheimer's and Cognitive Disorders panel, our firm, by way of my coverage, was one of the first to have a senior analyst focused solely on the neuro space. And within that framework, we were also one of the first to cover stocks of companies that happened to be developing psychedelic therapeutics via conventional FDA-focused pathways. So I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel, the future of psychedelics, innovation, regulation, and investment opportunities. Anytime a space has a Netflix series or a New York Times bestsellers devoted to it before we have a product passing phase 3 trials, we look at that with a little bit of a closer lens and think there's a little bit of hype that has exceeded the reality. Thankfully, all that has come out of the system. We're seeing this pocket of space in the neuro area develop a lot more. We've had MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, now known as Lykos, on the cusp of approval of their MDA-assisted psychotherapy. We have Compass Pathways reporting a bellwether first phase 3 trial later this summer. We had Cybin recently announced good phase 2 data. So a lot of things are happening in the space, which means that investors are beginning to re-engage in this space. So with that as a backdrop, I'll turn it over to our panelists. Thanks for being here. We'll go alphabetical by first name. That's how we're all sitting here. So I'll turn it over to Chris to introduce himself briefly. So in the introduction, I'd like you to please expound on what makes your company different. And we'll go 3 to 4 minutes each on that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm Chris Witowski. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Psilera. We are a next-generation psychedelics company. So what we are doing is developing better psychedelic molecules, and we can do this by modifying the drug, making small changes to remove side effects, things like hallucinations or the psychedelic effect itself. This will enable take-home treatments. It'll expand patient populations, open up better commercial models, and really what we're focused on is neurodegeneration, because we see this as a huge opportunity outside of psychiatry. We have filed for orphan drug designation for behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia. This is an early onset dementia with atrophy in the prefrontal cortex. You have serotonin, glutamate dysfunction that our lead candidate can rescue. By background, I have a PhD in organic chemistry, spent all my career doing natural product drug discovery and product development. I think for myself, I think across the panel, I'm the only one here that is looking at these sort of non-hallucinogenic molecules, and I'm sure there's questions that will be posed further, but really excited to be here and look forward to discussing with the panel.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Sunday. I'm Doug Drysdale. I'm the CEO of Cybin. Cybin is a public, late clinical stage drug development company focused on depression and anxiety disorders. For the benefit of the audience, essentially there are about a half a dozen companies in late stage clinical development, all working on 2 different categories of psychedelics. You have the first category, which produce emotive, mystical experiences, typically longer in duration, like psilocybin and LSD. And the second category are more intense, immersive, shorter acting treatments like 5-MeO, DMT, and DMT. And Cybin, the goal of Cybin is to create best-in-class novel compounds in both of those categories. Our view is that with these internalizing disorders like depression and anxiety, there's no one size fits all. So having options is always a good thing for patients and for providers. We've recently published data from both programs. We have a deuterated DMT program that's just wrapped up phase 1. We found safe and well-tolerated doses, very clean side effect profile, no serious adverse events. We're able to demonstrate or produce a 40-minute psychedelic experience from an IV infusion, or a 90-minute psychedelic experience from a single intramuscular injection, which makes this treatment potentially very, very scalable. So that molecule will move into phase 2 in generalized anxiety disorder before the end of quarter 1. Our lead asset, which is a deuterated analog of psilocybin, it's a non-prodrug analog. Just read out some phase 2 results in depression. Remarkably, we saw in both of the doses tested a 14-point reduction in depression score, in MADRS score, at 3 weeks after just a single dose of CYB003, which is our lead asset, which is remarkable compared to current standard of care treatments. After 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, we saw 8 out of 10 patients in remission from their depression 6 weeks after just 2 doses of CYB003, which is really quite remarkable and really unlike anything else that we use to treat depression today. So we're excited about some more long-term data we have coming up in the next few weeks, where we'll look at the efficacy of this asset at 3 months after a couple of doses. And we have an end of phase 2 meeting planned with the FDA this quarter, with the goal of moving into phase 3 by the end of quarter 1.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Kabir Nath. I'm the CEO of Compass Pathways. You don't have to be British to work in psychedelics, but as you'll discover when you hear Sahil, it does help. Compass is currently in phase 3 with COMP360, psilocybin treatment, for treatment-resistant depression. That's a horrible phrase, which effectively is defined as anyone who has failed 2 or more other drugs in the current episode of depression. In practice, it's really a proxy for people with chronic refractory depression, who typically over the course of their life will have cycled through multiple different oral drugs and currently are finding that nothing actually works for them. They may still be on SSRIs or something else as a kind of crutch, but typically nothing is actually helping to resolve their depressive symptoms. So Compass conducted a pretty large phase 2b, 233 patients, which read out in late 21 and was published in the New England Journal in November of 22. And what we saw there was, with a single dose of 25 milligrams with psychological support, we saw a response rate of 37%, and then we saw around 25% of patients still in remission after 12 weeks. And again, just a reminder, this is a population where anything else that has been tried has actually either failed or produced very modest effect sizes. And again, this was a 3-week primary endpoint where we saw a treatment difference of close to 6 on the MADRS. Based on that, we designed and are now well into a phase 3 program. 2 phase 3 trials ongoing, 1 placebo-controlled that, as Sumant mentioned, will read out in the summer of this year, and the second with the same 3 doses as we experimented with in phase 2b, that will read out next year. Importantly, building on experience we'd already seen, but I think also with Doug's recent experience from Cybin, in each of those, there's the potential for, in the first one, up to 3 doses, in the second, potentially up to 4 doses. Because clearly, one of the key questions here is truly what is the optimal dosing regimen, fully understanding that it's going to be different for different patients. There is no such thing as a typical patient with TRD. But we have people from the phase 2b who, after a single administration 2.5 years ago, have never taken another drug. But equally, there are clearly others who we expect will need more. I think, where are we differentiated? We just happen to be further ahead than anyone except the company now known as Lykos, who have already filed. But I think also importantly, our financing in August was really a pretty significant validation for the sector as well. So we raised $285 million, $125 million upfront, but more importantly, with a syndicate of 17 very well-known healthcare investors, all of whose names you would recognize, and which was really the first time that those dedicated healthcare specialists came in. And they are the ones who come in knowing that they're going to have to do another round this year and another round the next year and another round before launch. They really understand the nature of what we're doing. And that, I think, is also a significant change. Others have done so. Reunion with the take private by MPM, I think, was another example that really now these investors are waking up to the potential here. We all dive straight into the data, but just as a reminder, these are huge unmet needs. These are huge unmet needs. Treatment-resistant depression, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, essentially very little works for these today.
All right, thank you. I'm Sahil Kirpekar. I am the Chief Business Officer at Atai Life Sciences. I'm a physician by training, and I've been in the life sciences space for 17 plus years now. doing a range of roles, commercial strategy and business development in large and small companies. Atai Life Sciences was set up 7 years ago now with an intention to invest and progress significant treatments in mental health that will have transformational effect for their patients. We do this with a model where we invest in companies taking minority, majority, and at stake, as well as certain fully owned subsidiaries. And the idea is to progress these through to make sure that they are brought to patients through a strong set of evidence that can successfully help bring them through. We are significant investors and were seed investors in Compass Pathways, and now have a range of investments and assets which cover the whole range of psychedelic treatments, including the molecules. Some of them have been mentioned right now. We've got a DMT molecule, we've got 5-MeO-DMT, as well as an RMDMA and ibogaine. We also have certain non-psychedelic treatments that we continue to progress and are currently in phase 2, and are quite excited about the transformational effect that those could have in the areas of high unmet need. The final piece I will say is that the thesis that we've built all of these investments off is that there's pre-existing evidence in each of these treatments that we've looked at, either through use outside of formal clinical settings, or through very similar molecules that have been used in the past. It's a very exciting time for psychedelics, as been mentioned here, and very happy to be a part of this change.
Thanks, Sahil. I think you forgot to mention that you're probably responsible for one panelist not being here today with your recent investment in Beckley, so I'll get that out there. So the way we'll do this panel is we'll go through some areas of progress and opportunities, then we'll see how we set up for the future, and then we'll end with an investing and business development type section. So the first question I'm going to ask the panelists is a pretty controversial one, which could make the whole topic of this panel moot, which is, do we really require a psychedelic experience to have a good therapeutic outcome? And we'll start with Chris, because he probably has a little bit more of more to say on this.
What's Chris going to say?
I think I'm outnumbered here. I think first and foremost, it's very indication specific. I think when you look at the pre-existing evidence out there for psychiatry, I think it's very supportive that the psychedelic experience, the support alongside of it is important. What we're looking at in terms of neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's disease, dementia, frontotemporal dementia, psychedelic effects and hallucinations are actually comorbid for these patients. They have memory disorders. You can't properly prepare or integrate these patients. And also there's a high level of psychosis in these patients. So dosing them with a 2A hallucinogenic agonist is not going to leave them any better off. I think there's more and more evidence to support that these non-hallucinogenic next generation molecules can be effective. Certainly, I think the current clinical evidence is certainly in support of the hallucinogenic experience, but I think over time we'll come to find out that these molecules can be effective. I think the best question, or maybe the question out there is, what is the durability of this treatment? And, what is the dosing regimen in order to maintain efficacy? Is it better? Is it worse than currently what can be done with these first generation psychedelics and, second gen psychedelics? So, I think when you look at neuroplasticity as an underlying mechanism, I think there's a lot of potential there. And it's certainly not one that relies upon a psychedelic or hallucinogenic experience. If you look at TMS, ketamine, of course, I think is a good parallel, and look at some of the effects with psychedelics without the traditional 5-HT2A hallucinogenic experience. I think there is a lot of potential for these molecules, but currently the evidence is a little bit further behind the current clinical data.
Doug?
I'm going to go in sequence, okay. I largely agree with what Chris is saying. I think that for some neurological disorders, low dose 5-HT2A agonists, chronic dosing may have value. May have value in neurodegeneration, neuroinflammation, pain, neuropathic pain potentially, and which I hope that we get to see some of that research happen. Current treatments today, current modalities today also produce neuroplasticity. SSRIs produce neuroplasticity. Psychotherapy produces neuroplasticity. but not to the degree and intensity that is achieved with psychedelics. And it seems to me that intense experience, that intense neuroplasticity, is correlated with the very large and rapid reduction in symptoms that we're seeing. So no, maybe a psychedelic effect isn't necessary for some kind of efficacy, but if you want the rapid, large improvements that we're seeing with psychedelics that's so exciting about these treatments, then most likely it seems that that experience is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree. I mean, the easy answer is we don't know. Because I think, and I think it's important as a reminder also, which is, there is a lot of hype around psychedelics. There's a lot of excitement. But since 2010, since the resurgent, I'm not even sure you're at 1,000 patients that have been treated with many of these worldwide. I mean, maybe it's a few more than that, but we're still very, very early in the rediscovery of psychedelics. Our study of 233 patients was the biggest so far. Most other studies have been smaller. And to Chris's point, none of these non-hallucinogenics have got into the only animal model that works in psychiatry or in neurology, which is the human animal. Yeah, because unfortunately, translation from other animals is kind of funky, but not very relevant.
That's kind of a reminder to me that it's easier to ask the questions than to generate the answers, but you still need to ask the right questions. So for Sahil, who's on the business development side, it's kind of the same question with a bit of a tweak to it. When you look at a molecule for business development purposes, would you rather have a psychedelic molecule or a non-psychedelic molecule for the same indication?
Well, the simple answer is depends on the mechanism and the data. I just to concur, we don't know the answer. To correct something that Chris might have said earlier, we also, atai has some very early non-psychedelic molecules. So we do see the possibilities and potential there. When we are exploring portfolio and pipeline expansion opportunities, psychiatry is notorious that animal data does not replicate. It's very hard to find animal models that are meaningful. And so I personally have a view that, yes, we will have homegrown non-psychedelic molecules that will continue to progress. But if we were to place a bet on something externally, I'd rather wait to see some clinical data and see that it's worked before going there.
Yeah, I'd just add, obviously, the financial proposition is very different. Okay, of course. So developing novel chronic neurodegenerative drugs or treatments for psychiatry requires many studies, not just a couple, large numbers, small effect sizes. And that's really quite different to what we're seeing with psychedelics, which have a very rapid and large effect and very significant effect sizes, essentially acute treatments. So it's a different investment decision.
Chris, anything to add, Chris?
Yeah, I think as Doug alluded to, it is a different type of investor. It's a different risk proposition as well. I mean, to take a no molecule that's been effectively studied for thousands of years with pre-existing clinical literature is one thing. To develop a new molecule on a new mechanism of action is certainly something different. So, I think the potential is great in both areas. It's, I think, as everyone has alluded to, it's a big market. There's going to be plentiful opportunities for 5-methoxy-DMT, for psilocybin, for deuterated derivatives, for these non-hallucinogenics. And I think it really comes down to having the optionality for patients and physicians, because I think the heterogeneity across all of these patients, there's not going to be a one drug treats all. So to have these available, I think is really crucial.
Yeah, and just to build on Sahil's point, I mean, even at Compass, we'll be hedging our bets as well. I mean, we talk to a lot of these discovery companies and so on, and we'll continue to do so. So, got it. We'll follow the science.
So now I'll move on to the next kind of, it's somewhat controversial maybe, but it all depends on the terminology used, right? We got to use the right terms here. So what about psychological support? I know some people confuse that with psychotherapy and things like that, but do you think psychological support is necessary for, I guess, easing the patient into what could be a phenomenon, like some sort of thing they feel with the therapeutic here? So we'll start with Sahil and then move backwards.
Sure. So I think just to get everyone on the same page, it's worth aligning on what we're talking about here. So the first psychedelic, if you may call it that, MDMA, that is now with the regulators, is it's MDMA assisted therapy, which means it needs psychotherapy. A therapist is having therapy for 8 hours over 3 sessions, and that's psychotherapy. When we talk about psychological support, this is essentially 1 or 2 minimally trained individuals being present with the patient as they go through a pharmaceutical treatment, and there's no talking therapy as such ongoing at the same time. There's also an element of preparing the patient and integration after the treatment. That's an important part of psychological support. I believe, and what the field has so far shown is, unless there's something which specifically depends on the psychotherapeutic aspect of things, what we do need is psychological support. That's where the FDA has gone with their guidelines, and there's no current data that drives things in a direction where psychotherapy as such will be critical for getting treatment effect.
Kabir, your perspective, given you're well into a phase 3 here?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is as long as psychiatrists and psychotherapists both exist, we are not going to solve this question. So that's the first thing to say. But I think to build on what Sahil has done, and to some extent our CMO, Guy Goodwin, put the cat among the pigeons with a paper in the middle of last year, per FDA regulatory guidelines at the moment, you require a therapist, you require a certain level of trained therapist in the room with the patient. That's unique to the States. In our studies in Europe, it's actually can be a nurse. And if you talk to people in Switzerland who have been doing these for years in group sessions, it's whoever happens to be available in the office will sit in the room. So our view is that preparation, ensuring that somebody is in the right mental state for this and has a real view and expectation and understanding of what may happen, is fundamental. And also something, and again, I think unfortunately preparation and integration are kind of jargony terms, but that's what we all use right now. And again, after the experience, the need to talk it through, to make sense of it, and frankly, to agree how is this integrated into some form of future treatment or something. Because I think the other thing to be very clear is, maybe for the very rare patient, this is a magic bullet, and they walk out that day, the next morning, and never need anything again, therapy, SSRIs, or whatever. That's going to be a vanishingly rare patient. Yes, that's not how the course of serious mental illness goes. So we see both of those as fundamental. Does it necessarily need to be a therapist even in those settings? No. And that's where we are. Now, at the same time, you clearly will read impassioned defenses, typically from therapists, of why it's the therapy that's doing the work. And as I say, the agencies have talked about factorial trials, and eventually we may get to the scale where some of us have enough money to indulge ourselves with those sorts of trials, but right now none of us are in a position to do that.
Yeah, I agree. It's in many ways it's more of a clinical trial approach, in that we clearly have to separate any benefits of psychotherapy from the drug itself. But I think from results that we've seen in a number of phase 2 studies now, clearly that psychotherapy isn't necessary. We are providing psychological support in our studies, but primarily it's about preparation, as Kabir said. You wouldn't want to send a psychedelic naive patient into a psychedelic experience without some kind of preparation. And that is just normal for really any treatment. You wouldn't send a cancer patient for chemotherapy without some kind of setting expectations for them. Also, and maybe uniquely with psilocybin, we see that not everyone gets across the line the first time. Some people are hesitant, maybe they're a bit skeptical, maybe they're a little bit afraid. For example, we saw a 53% response rate in our depression study from the first dose of psilocybin, our psilocybin analog. But there's no better preparation for a treatment than a first dose. So for the second dose, we see much better responses, and patients know what to expect, and they get more from the session. So that response rate went from 53% to 80% after the second dose. So it just shows, I think the data now is showing that preparation's important. So the better preparation we can give the patients, the more likely we are to get positive outcomes for even the first dose, and then build on that with future doses.
Chris, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think there is a correlate out there that you can look at, and that's ketamine. I think it's very minimally observed, just harm reduction mostly. When it comes to psychotherapy, I think it really adds a lot of how do you standardize something like that in the eyes of the FDA, and how do you standardize it and replicate it? There's obviously some CRO sites that are going to do a much better job than others, so that can lead to some clinical differences. So I think taking a minimalist approach is probably the right approach.
And just to add to that, the standardization piece is critical. And one of the things that we are actively working on and have made very significant progress on is having a digital tool, which will definitely do the preparation and integration and will be part of what the FDA approves if and when the drug gets approved.
So moving on to the next topic, I mean, a couple of companies on stage here have depression or some variants thereof as their lead programs. We've seen 340 million prescriptions each year written for antidepressants in the US. Clearly, those are, it's treated chronically right now. This could be more of an acute or episodic type treatment. So what sort of durability of effect do you think you would consider a sweet spot? I know that's not been answered scientifically, but putting your commercial hats on, what do you think is good? We'll start with Sahil first, and then we'll
So it's a very good question. And when I think about this, I would, obviously you can model a lot of this out, and there's always answers that way, but there's no fun to that in some ways. The way I would think about it is analogs. And if you think of analogs, there's clearly long-acting injectables, the antipsychotics, depot injectables that have been used. Those started with monthly and then went on to as long as 6 months. There's obviously DMS, which is another, and ECT, which is another episodic mental health, episodic treatment for mental health disorders. And that is anywhere between 3 to 6 months as a frequency. And again, as you said, the evidence is yet to establish what's right. We also believe that there's an element of personalization through data that will go into if and when the patient should be redosed. And as the field learns more through evidence and data and analytics, we'll get there. But commercially, and to make the balance work in terms of the pain of going through this and pain to the system and infrastructure rather than the patient, the 3 to 6 month point makes a lot of sense if we can show the durability to be as we expect it to be and hope for it to be.
Kabir?
Yeah, I think so. We don't know what the optimum is going to be. I mean, as I said, in our phase 3, and those two do run for 52 weeks, we will get much more robust data around the range of patients and what works for different patients. But I think I would agree with Sahil. I mean, right now, somewhere between 2 and 4 treatments with something like psilocybin may turn out to be right. But again, is it going to be 2-3 weeks apart? Are we actually going to see that actually enables you to extend duration much further from that, shall we say, initial pair of dosing? We just don't know the answer to that.
So I'd look at this in a couple of different ways. I think from an internal development point of view, regardless of payers and reimbursement, our optimal goal would be somewhere around 6 months. At 6 months, these treatments become acute rather than intermittent. And that's helpful from a drug development point of view, safety database, follow-up, long-term follow-up, et cetera. So that would impact development costs. When we've run a number of analyses, maybe 100 or so different scenarios where you look at different durabilities of effect based upon different durations of treatment, it seems to us from our analysis that once you get beyond about 8 weeks, these treatments start to be pretty interesting financially. Once you get beyond 3 months, they become more than interesting financially. They become really quite dominant in terms of your financial choices. So I think anything beyond 3 months would be very exciting from a couple of doses. And we saw from our DMT study, 40% of patients in remission at 6 months after just a couple of doses. So I think that definitely the opportunity is there. It'll be a combination of the right molecule, the right dose strength, and the right protocol, I think. But we're all aiming for the same thing. And I think it's a pretty easy case to make to payers if you can deliver with 1 or 2 doses, 3-6 months of durability.
And Chris, how do you approach that, given that not all your indications are depression related, right?
Yeah, so our model is different. Our drugs are non-hallucinogenic. They don't have the psychedelic effects. So we can look at a traditional take-home model for our drugs, which from a prescription perspective, for commercial perspective, is just a lot cleaner. that is helpful within this next generation class. While we're not in the clinic yet, and I hope we can boast, 3-6 month efficacy with a single dose, I don't think these types of molecules will be able to do that. I think they're, if you had to pin me down, I think it's probably in a weekly, bi-weekly format, but we'll let the data play out. But from a drug development and commercial perspective, that's really actually not a bad problem to have when the dosing is a little more frequently, and on a take-home basis, you're not incurring the clinical dosing and supervision costs of the psychedelic treatment.
I'd say, like, from our perspective, investors, I hope the science evolves to a 3 to 6 months, because then it'll get easier for us to model all these things. But let's move on to clinical trials and regulatory interactions now. Blinding, is that an issue or not? And if so, why? If not, why not? We'll start with Chris.
Yeah, well, I'm not in this psychedelic sphere, but certainly with our drugs, it's a little bit easier to do a double-blind placebo trial when your drug doesn't have dramatic psychological effects. I think for the traditional psychedelics, certainly it's hard to run a traditional placebo blinded trial. In some ways, I think it's perhaps helpful because you can get maybe a better signal from your patients and a nocebo response, perhaps in some cases, but it also increases expectancy. So I think there's challenges on either side of that argument, but I think maybe some of the others might be better able to answer.
Yeah, it's clear to me from the draft FDA guidelines that FDA is comfortable with functional unblinding. The fact that they've recommended 2 studies in phase 3, one with an inert placebo safety and one with an active placebo to overcome that nocebo concern, says to me that they're comfortable with that. The other thing to bear in mind too is when we look at a number of phase 2 studies, there was a significant placebo effect in really all of them. So placebo was working. I'd also say that when we looked at our blinded phase 2 data, we looked at the visual analog scores, these visual measures of visual effects that the patients experienced. We couldn't tell who had placebo and who had active from that blinded data. So I think even though there is functional unblinding, the placebo is working in these cases.
Yeah, I would just add to what Doug said. I mean, this is where it clearly is an issue, and the design of 2 studies, one with placebo, one with an active control, is a compromise. But it was clear to us in designing our phase 3 that we did need a real safety baseline, which is why we have one placebo-controlled trial. But also in the 2B, to Doug's point, it worked pretty well using 1 milligram. And just a reminder, which is also helpful, we are studying a psychedelically naive population. So in phase 2B, 94% had never had any form of declared psychedelic experience. Given the passage of time, we've relaxed that a little in phase 3, but it's still going to be 85% plus who've never had a psychedelic experience. And that actually means you truly have no idea if you're getting 1, 10, 25. And what we saw is there is a fair amount of intersubject variability. There are people on 1 milligram who got a fulsome hallucinogenic experience. There are a handful of people on 25 who got not many, but you do see that fair amount of intersubject variability as well.
Yeah, I mean, all I'll say is a lot has been said. Let's see where the data pans out with the 2 phase 3s over the next couple of years, which is going to be the largest data set showing that. It's really positive where the FDA has landed on this. And I think that definitely gives all of us confidence.
And this is not a new problem either. Plenty of drugs have side effects where the patient knows they're taking the active. There's many examples of it.
Well, one would think the nocebo might help you here, right? In that case. But you mentioned the FDA, Sahil, so I'm going to open up that can of worms now. How receptive do you think the FDA truly is to such approaches? And anything, like, we know the FDA issued draft guidelines recently on clinical trials in this space. I know most of us are not scientists here, but if you were to tweak those guidelines, what would you do?
So I'll take your first question first. I'll take your first question first. I think the FDA has been fantastic with this, and the guidelines, the way they've been drafted, the collaboration and the consultation that's gone into it is strong. they resonated quite well with what was going on and what most companies were thinking about. Clearly, learning from the large, ongoing, and successful trials when they were drafted, including the Compass Phase 2b. I think one of the pieces that I personally think will evolve and would need to evolve is the extent of psychotherapy involvement and in-person involvement. They've been fairly prescriptive about that and quite stringent, including 2 people for each patient, and that's going to be challenging as things move forward. That's where the FDA will and should get comfortable over time, as assuming that things do progress well with the current trials.
Kabir?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the agency has been very engaged. We have breakthrough designation, so we've been talking to the agency about COMP360 for around 6 years by now. So I would say it's a good relationship, but all regulatory agencies hate precedents, and they're about to do that with MDMA potentially. I think we're all going to be watching very closely the progress of the Lykos application in terms of how do they disentangle these questions around relative benefit against safety of what is a limited number of episodic doses. The one thing I would say, though, is remember that not treating these patients is actually also an active choice, where many of them will die by suicide. So, not treating these patients is also an active choice. And I think you can expect to see at the Lykos AdCom, there will be a great deal of patient advocacy and so on. And I think you would expect that for any of us if we're lucky enough to actually end up in a regulatory process.
Yeah, not really too much to add. I agree that the FDA so far has been pretty industry friendly and pragmatic, and great to see them get out with draft guidelines fairly early in the evolution, the development of these treatments. I agree with you, Sahil. I think the need for 2 observers and the level of qualifications for those observers is overkill. We know it's based on some experiences with the MDMA studies. Let's be honest about that. But also, I hope that FDA can see that MDMA is a very different animal. The patient's in a very different state, perhaps a more vulnerable state than with these other studies. So I think our studies that are running should prove that we have safe protocols. And I'm hoping that the FDA's attitude here will evolve positively. But that said, even if we remain with these protocols, the kind of outcomes we're seeing are worth the effort. Right?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, because we always focus completely on the US, CHMP and the various different national bodies are also very supportive. So we took scientific advice up front. We're actually currently engaged with certain key countries around further advice. I would say they also have been very supportive. It does vary from country to country. You have some countries where Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the UK, which are obviously not in the EU, but still where there is actually a lot of support, even at federal level and so on. The challenge with Europe is, as you'd expect, we're not running the placebo-controlled trial in Europe because it wasn't even worth trying. And secondly, nobody, as far as I know, knows how to make money out of psychiatry in Europe. So that's a bigger challenge that we're going to have to deal with.
Chris, anything to add, given your programs are different?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I agree that the guidance was very sensible by the FDA, and I do agree the qualification levels of those 2 observers is a little constraining, especially when you look at the sheer amount of people that you would need to facilitate these types of therapies. I think that is going to probably create a bottleneck sometime this decade with the potential drugs coming to market. But I mostly agree with the panel.
This is mostly a question for Doug and Kabir, to some extent Sahil, so I might involve you in the later part of this one. But commercial models, let's fast forward to a world where you have like an almost approved product or even an approved psychedelic therapeutic for depression, let's say. So is the world really ready for episodic treatments versus chronic treatments?
Yeah, I think so. Like as Kabir has said, there's a massive unmet need here. We've been trying to treat the symptoms of depression for decades, putting Band-Aids on these patients and not providing any kind of real cure. When we talk to our psychiatrist colleagues, they get so frustrated with their inability to really do anything to help patients. They're just switching to another another treatment. So the opportunity to develop something that is works like an intervention in this episodic way is very attractive to providers and to patients. And of course, I'm going to bring up Spravato because it's a natural analog. Spravato is an episodic treatment. Admittedly, the treatment cycle is a little more intense than we're anticipating, so that means that our treatments will be less burdensome than Spravato. But quarter 3 sales, $370 million globally. That's a run rate of $1.5 billion. So clearly, these episodic treatments have the potential to be blockbuster treatments.
So I agree with Doug, but with the caveat is let none of that make it sound as if it's going to be easy, because it clearly is not, because it clearly is a fundamental paradigm shift in how psychiatrists currently have the ability to treat their patients. And it does require, in the case of certainly the first drugs like MDMA and potentially psilocybin, it does require this intense duration. It's a 6 to 8 hour experience that occupies a room in a treatment center for a day. That's one of the reasons why jointly with Lykos, we did the work to obtain a CPT tracking code, which is now in place that actually enables people to start tracking that and has the potential to be a reimbursed code by the time we launch, assuming that Lykos is successful in getting approval. So I completely agree with Doug. I think there is a deep recognition of the need for this. I think the nature of psychiatry practice is also changing in some ways. You have interventional psychiatry centers. You have a movement away from individual sole practices or even small practices. But we have some big problems to solve. 50% of this country is white space with no psychiatrists at all. So how are we actually going to deliver treatments like that in some of those settings? So, yes, I think we have to be ready for that, and some of the infrastructure will be there, but I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy. So I just remind you of that when you're doing your models.
On that note, I'm going to ask a question that's even less easy to answer, I guess, which is to both of you first. What's your general philosophy on pricing of a product like this?
I'm going to let you take that one first. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the good news is we have to wait for data. So we have to wait for data. We have to see what the magnitude of effect is. We have to see what the durability is. We have to understand the number of settings and so on. Obviously, we're doing work now looking at data sets around what the current cost of a typical patient with treatment-resistant depression is. And again, there's no such thing, but there's a range of costs there. Understanding what esketamine has been able to support by way of pricing and so on. But that's all work that we will be doing in parallel with the phase 3 over the next couple of years.
Yeah, obviously it's hard to get very specific about pricing of individual doses without knowing what the ultimate durability is going to be. I can see a scenario where treatments that provide longer durability cost a little more, and others provide shorter durability, maybe cost a little less. Maybe it's a similar annual cost for the same outcome. We've run hundreds of scenarios around this because obviously we don't have that longer term data just yet. We have 3-month data coming soon. But like I said earlier, when you start looking at quality adjusted life years and the potential return on investment from these treatments, once you get beyond about 8 weeks of durability, they look really quite interesting. And 3 months and beyond, really very interesting. Even in Europe, actually, where obviously the hurdles in Europe from a pharmacoeconomic perspective are a lot higher than they are here in the US, NICE, et cetera. But with 3-month durability, we can hit those hurdles as well.
So do you think the clinical infrastructure and training needs can be addressed effectively with companies of your size, or are we looking at something much, much bigger here? Doug and Kabir, and then I'll move to Sahil and Chris for a different part of that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a ramp, obviously. It takes time to change minds and train folks to build infrastructure. I will say that there's a sort of pending need out there. You've got ketamine centers, TMS centers, interventional psychiatry centers are all waiting for these, so they want to be ready and prepared. We've developed a training program for facilitators, psychedelic facilitators called Embark. So far, we've had over 3,000 people sign up for that training program. So there's definitely a demand and a need, but it'll take some time. But I think once you start to see patient testimonials, and you start to see the kind of outcomes that we're seeing in clinical studies and how very different the approach is to current treatments, there'll be a massive pull of demand, is my view. The infrastructure may take a little time to get there. But if you're a psychiatrist and you have a patient that's come from primary care, they've tried their third treatment or so, what are your options? Your options are to give them another chronic drug that's likely to be, each round of treatment is dwindling in terms of additional incremental benefit. And each of those later drugs tend to have higher, worse side effects. You can go down that path, or you could try one dose of a psychedelic. What have you got to lose? There's not a long-term financial commitment or safety risk. It's, let's just try a test dose and see what happens. So, but getting to that point may take some time.
Yeah, I agree with Doug. I think it's easier to imagine what this is going to look like, say, in 10 years' time with multiple drugs approved across indications. And quite clearly at that point, you're not going to have therapists individually trained in each company's molecule for each indication. There'll be something that's a much more broad baseline. I think the question is going to be for Lykos and then potentially for us, what do you need to do to assure the right patient choice and the really good patient experiences at launch? And I think that's a question that all of us are thinking about as we prepare for that. But I agree with Doug. I think, and we know it from our studies, sadly, there is absolutely no lack of patient interest or patient demand. And I think you're also seeing many therapists and psychiatrists truly want to do this because they have so few good options for these patients today.
Now move on to a slightly different line of questioning on the commercial side, but companies need to think about this really early. That's around patent protection exclusivities. So Chris, I'll start with you. What's your view on that? And then Sahil, how do you approach that when you look at business development transactions?
Yeah, so for us, we've always been focused on creating novel molecules. How do we tweak a traditional psychedelic tryptamine and make it a better molecule, orally available, having the right half-life, reducing cardiovascular risk, reducing hallucinogenic side effects? We've developed a really unique platform that allows us to virtually screen these compounds very quickly across multiple CNS receptors. So I'm proud to say we've got about 10 million composition of matter drugs covered within our patent portfolio. We still have more patents, being uncovered. Most of our work is public now, but we're still filing further patents. And for a biotech company, every biotech company, including everybody up here, has patent protection. Without that, you don't really have much to hang your hat on commercially. So certainly that's been, one of the strengths is the composition of matter with these new derivatives.
Sahil, how about you, business development wise?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that IP is fundamental, and we have across our pipeline been very clear that given that we would go for either first-in-class and or best-in-class molecules, they come with the need to have IP to protect that status. And we have that throughout. When looking at external investments, that's a very fundamental box that needs to be ticked before we would consider moving forward. There is a view that this space is less about IP and more about the rest. I would say to an extent, as long as you find a way of protecting yourself and creating the moat as you would need to maintain that status. That does not mean that IP is excusable.
Doug?
Yeah, it's clear. I think that that investors have gotten comfortable with the IP landscape. I think the round that Compass did back in August, Lykos just did a $100 million round with an asset you'd expect to have maybe the weakest IP of all the psychedelics out there, but still investors have found a way to get comfortable. We've been very focused on IP. We have 35 or so patents granted, 170 or so patents pending. But even when you run worst case scenarios with no IP, it still results in 8-9 years of exclusivity for companies that don't have it. So potentially a return still possible. For us to focus on IP is so we can extend that runway. We have a composition of matter protection up to 2041. And that will enable us to have not only more years at peak sales, but to invest in the asset and keep expanding indications and broaden patient usage and market share over time.
Kabir, anything to add? Or?
No.
Okay. In that case, like we have a minute left, so I'm going to squeeze in a buzzer beater question for each of you, which is, what do you think, if you had to pick a key challenge in this, what would it be? Is it reimbursement? Is it safety? Or how do you kind of differentiate between the statute of limitations and the efficacy of a product leading to an adverse event maybe 6 months from now? So what are some of the key challenges that you consider? One challenge each.
All right, I can go first. I think it's the risk of having an early safety event that turns the clock back to an extent or triggers reactions from the authorities that could pull things back to an extent that we haven't seen. That's a real risk.
So actually, I agree with that, but you want me to say something different, which is, I think, the ability to scale commercially here. I mean, I think as we talk to investors, they understand the traditional chronic oral model. They understand that Karuna was going to have 400 reps, that Sage was going to have 400 reps, and so on. They know that we're not going to have 400 reps because that's really not going to work for detailing psilocybin. But what are we going to do? What's that mix? What does that allocation of resources look like? That's a key question.
Yeah, so Sahil, I agree with you. As part of our focus is the safety aspect, but really, as we're moving from phase 2 to phase 3, the challenge for us now is scaling to a multinational trial and doing it in a way that is robust and avoids those safety issues. Doing it carefully, not rushing, and executing very, very well. We can't afford to do this twice. Let's get it right the first time. So it's really a focus now on execution.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think one of the bigger challenges is not having the traditional liquid biomarkers that many other industries have. It's always been an overhang in psychiatry and in neuroscience. We're looking at unique ways to bring in EEG to target brain and look at glutamate response, but not having those traditional biomarkers, it's more challenging to recruit the right patients who are going to be responders to the drugs. So, I mean, more investment, more research is going to be done, and we'll certainly follow that research. But at least from where I'm sitting right now, that is a challenge.
All right. Thanks a lot. I guess we can encroach on the coffee break for a minute in case anyone has any burning questions from the audience.